present to you on this lovely Edinburgh morning. For the majority of you, this is a one-off event. And here you are to enjoy the masterclass that we're going to have with our honoured guest, William Ury. For a small number of us, however, this is the last day of a 7-day journey that we have had over the past week. And what a wonderful journey we have had. For those of you who are not aware, we have had the International Academy of Mediators Spring Conference in Edinburgh over the past several days. And that has involved a number of really exciting and stimulating, inspiring events. We started off with a workshop, 2 workshops actually last Wednesday afternoon. We had a lecture by Professor Hal Abramson on Nelson Mandela as negotiator, which was really fascinating. We had what we call frothy suppers and enlightenment mode last Wednesday evening around the High Street of Edinburgh, with 2 days of really remarkable conference sessions. This is for over 120 mediators who brought along, many of them, the spouses and partners, from all over the world, 20 different countries, who are members and guests of the International Academy of Mediators. We had a reception in Parliament Hall on Thursday. We had a reception at the Castle on Friday. On Saturday we had an event which, for me, I think goes down, I think it probably does go down as a highlight of my professional career. And that was sitting in the chamber of the Scottish Parliament, listening to William Ury and the First Minister. And William was his customary scintillating best. For me, the First Minister gave the best speech I ever gave in my life, which elevated her in Scotland to a position of statesmanlikeness, which was, I think, welcomed by our guests from all around the world. We adjourned, not quite directly, but in due course, to Her Majesty's Royal Yacht Britannia on Thursday evening, and then we had the opening inaugural International Academy of Mediators golf tournament yesterday at Ely in Fife, in which I mastered the 8 holes. One of the things that happened on the Royal Yacht Britannia was that we completed the signing of what we call the Edinburgh Declaration of International Mediators, and I haven't counted, but well over 100 people have signed, mediators from all around the world, have signed this declaration about what it means to be a mediator, what we believe in, and what we're committed to. I think there are copies of the text amongst your papers on the desk, and the final signatory photograph of the Britannia at about 11:30, I think, on Saturday evening, is William Ury. And what an honour it is for us to have his name at the top of this wonderful statement of what mediation means, and to have it done in Edinburgh, where many of us have been working hard over many years to bring mediations before, is such a wonderful thing to be able to experience and to acknowledge. So that's the journey that many of us have been on. It's great though to see so many of you here this morning coming for this event and to hear William speaking. How many of you were here in 2009 in this very venue? Gosh, that's quite a number of you. Excellent. Ken, Stephen, nice to see you, and David, yeah. I remember standing on this very stage and saying that it was, for me, the fulfillment of not a lifetime dream, but certainly a many-year dream since going to Harvard in 1996 to study Getting to Yes under Roger Fisher, William's co-author of Getting to Yes. It was a dream to bring William Ury to this country. And as I stood on this stage on that morning, it just felt to be such a fulfillment, I suppose. And I remember the event was entitled Core at the Hub, which had a ring about it in those days. But here we are, 8 years later, and we're here together again. And it did occur to me as I was reflecting on this morning how the world has changed. And if it was relevant and helpful to us to have William here back in 2009, I think it would be as relevant and helpful to have him here today. I was just thinking, the recession had just begun, the recession, the financial crash had just begun in 2008. And you and I, and Jim Mather, the then business minister of the Scottish Government, and Ian Marchant, then chief executive of Scottish and Southern Energy, met and we talked about the upcoming Copenhagen climate change meeting, COP19, with all the hopes and optimism we had back then. And my goodness me, well, I suppose they got there in large part in Paris many years later. But climate change has become an even more pointed risk for us as we look forward. But we've got all the issues around migration Declaration, much more focused than they were back then. The Syrian war, I suppose, has become one of the major calamities since 2009, but you were talking about Venezuela. I have experienced what's happening in South Sudan, where there are millions of people either dead or dislocated because of the internal violence of these communities. And then we think about Brexit, which we would not have imagined, I don't really think, in 2009, and very few of us would have done. We, of course, were well in advance of the Scottish independence referendum, and you were well in advance. In fact, you were just elected Barack Obama, and who would have thought in 2009 that his successor has become Donald Trump. So extraordinary changes in a relatively short period of time in human history, certainly a relatively short period of time in the history of this planet, and yet posing for us crucial questions and challenges. So it's a timely return, William, and I want to extend to you a very, very warm Edinburgh welcome. One of the occasions on Saturday following our event in the Scottish Parliament Chamber was the conferring of an honorary degree by the University of Edinburgh on William, and I had the honour to give the laureation. I don't propose to go through all of that again. Here's one man who just does not need an introduction, and I will not do that. But we have a very interesting day. We've got a morning in which we'll hear from William talking about getting to yes with yourself, and there will be some of these books available for purchase if you wish at lunchtime. Well, I should mention our stars, just some of the encouragement to think about things for purchase. This, believe it or not, is the International Mediators Term, launched last week, specially designed and woven for our conference, called International Mediators, or International Academy Mediators, so we've used all for events like this. There are still a number of them for sale. Andrew Burnett will willingly sell them to any of you who would like to have yourselves adorned with these scarves. And any day, somebody might have gone a mile was stopped yesterday wearing it, and the tourist said, "Where did you get this? It was wonderful." There are only a few of them available, folks. Moving on. Getting to yes with yourself. William will talk about that this morning. There'll be an opportunity for some interaction and reflection, because, of course, getting to yes with yourself is very much a reflective process, as much as a discursive one. In the afternoon, you and I will have a conversation, and we'll talk about what's going on in the world. We'll try and focus on some of the constitutional issues that are occurring in this country. We will talk about William's work not only in Colombia, but Korea. And those of us who heard him mention the work on Saturday in the Parliament will look forward in anticipation to hearing more. I've had the privilege of hearing much more, and it is a fascinating story. What's going on behind the scenes and about the role of the third side of it. So we'll do that in the afternoon. We'll also hear from Gabby, William's daughter, who is here with us as an honoured guest. Gabby, you're very, very welcome. Lovely to meet you and get to know you, to meet you again. So that's the day. The day will unfold in, I hope, a reasonably informal way. We'll improvise in it. We'll see what happens. And we'll enjoy ourselves enormously. So, as I say, no formal introduction from me. But on this occasion, I introduced William Ury not as a stranger, but as a friend. And I'm just delighted and privileged I want to do so. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, John. It's an enormous pleasure to be back in Edinburgh, back in Scotland, and to talk about what I think is perhaps the greatest challenge that we today in our communities, in our families, in our governments, in our societies, and in our world face, which is how do we deal with our differences constructively rather than destructively. And I think that issue is as important, if not more important, than when I was here last time in 2009, as John was just mentioning. I'd actually like to begin with a quote from Adam Smith, which I think is really the theme of the day, which goes, the first thing you have to know is yourself. A man who knows himself, a woman who knows herself, I would say, can step outside themselves and watch their reactions as an observer. Because what I hope to talk about with you today and to really engage you in conversation about is this question of how do we influence other people? That's really the art of negotiation, is influencing other people. Seeing if we can persuade them to change their minds, perhaps, And the best instrument we have is ourselves. So the question is, how do we tune our own instruments? How can we get to yes with ourselves in order better to get to yes with others? And that's the question I'd like to pose with us this morning. Because I found that that's really the foundation. I found that actually the biggest, I guess, lesson I've learned over the last 40 years of wandering around the world, wandering around the planet in many different kinds of conflicts, from family feuds to business disputes to governmental disputes to wars of various kinds, is our biggest opponent is the person that I look at in the morning, every morning, that we all look at in the morning, which is ourselves, which is our normal human tendency, as Adam Smith put it, to react, to act without thinking. As Ambrose Bierce once put it, when angry, you will make the best speech you will ever regret. And I think that's more often than not. And the question is, how can we turn that biggest opponent into our biggest ally? Really, how can we become our own biggest ally so that we can be then of maximal service to ourselves and in particular to others around us, to our communities, as we seek to grapple with the very difficult issues that we face in today's world. I'd like to begin, if I may, with a story that perhaps many of you may have heard me tell before, but it's one of my favorite stories that actually illustrates this point. I've done a lot of work in the Middle East, and it's an old story from the ancient Middle East about a man who passed away and left to his 3 sons 17 camels. And to the first son, the eldest son, he left half the camels, and to the middle son he leaves a third of the camels, and to the youngest son he leaves a ninth of the camels. Well, the 3 brothers get into a little bit of a negotiation, and it turns out not to be so easy because 17 doesn't divide by 2, and it doesn't divide by 3, and it doesn't divide by 9. So they get into a quarrel, and brotherly relations start to get strained, and violence is even a possibility, and finally, in desperation, they consult a wise woman. She thinks about their problem for a long time, and comes back and says, well, I don't know if I can help you, but I happen to have a camel. Would you like my camel? And so they say, fine. So then they have 18 camels. Well, 18, as it turns out, does divide by 2, so the first son takes his half of 18 is 9. The second son takes his third. A third of 18 is 6. The youngest son takes his ninth. A ninth of 18 is 2. If you add 9 and 6, you get 15, plus 2, 17. They have 1 camel left over. They give it back to the wise woman. If you think about that story for a moment, I think you'll find that it resembles a lot of the difficult negotiations that we get involved in. We often start off with 17 camels, no way to resolve the situation. What that woman does is she steps back to what I call the balcony. Like we have a balcony above here, which is a place of perspective, a place of calm, a place where you can see the big picture, a place where you can focus on your genuine objective. You can keep your eyes on the prize. And that's really what I'd like to focus with you on this morning is, how do we negotiate from the perspective of the balcony, from the perspective that Adam Smith calls the observer, the one who can observe their own reactions, so that we can actually act proactively in pursuit of our best interests, rather than, as I often find in conflict, we lose sight of our best interests and we get involved in destructive disputes. That's really what I'd like to talk about. Now, negotiation, the way I would define it very simply and very broadly, is simply the act of back and forth communication. You're trying to reach agreement with the other party or other parties, and you perhaps have some interests which you hold in common, like an ongoing relationship perhaps, like between Scotland and Britain. And you also have issues in tension, like around the question of devolution of constitutional powers. And the question is, how do we reach agreement under those challenging circumstances? So I'd like just to ask you, if I may, just a few questions about your own experience as negotiators. So the first question I have to ask is, if you think about your day, who do you find yourself in negotiation with in the course of your day? you wouldn't mind just calling it out just to see what the variety here is in the room. Who do you negotiate with in the course of your day? Would you say?
Your wife.
Your wife, your spouse. Okay. Starts at home. Your kids. Okay. Other team members. Yourself, of course, right? That's right. What else? Who else do you negotiate with? Who else do you find yourself having challenging, perhaps, negotiations with? Clients. Okay, clients, for sure. Who else? Your boss.
Other drivers on the road.
Other drivers on the road when you're driving. Okay. Who else?
Some people, God.
Excuse me?
For some people, God.
For some people, God. You're negotiating with God. Actually, one of the projects I've developed over the years is called the Abraham Path, which is a little bit like the Santiago de Compostela in the Middle East. And God had this negotiation with, Abraham had this negotiation with God in which he was trying to save the city of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's maybe the earliest recorded negotiation we know about. And he said, he dared to negotiate with the most powerful authority to save, for the sake of human rights, really, for the sake of justice. He said, are you going to destroy the city? What if I could find 50 righteous individuals? Would you still destroy it? And God says, no. So Abraham says, well, what if I could find 45? And God says, well, maybe I would spare it. How about 40? 35? And he bargains God down to 10. But unfortunately, Abraham can't even find 10. So unfortunately, those cities are destroyed. But it's an early example of negotiating, as we often do, from a position of inferior power with someone with much greater power. And that's one of the questions we can deal with today is, how do you deal in an asymmetrical situation? As I understand, as I was reading about Scotland, for example, trying to negotiate with the UK right now around Brexit, with the UK government, there's an asymmetric power. How do you negotiate in those kinds of situations is something we'll look at. Who else do you negotiate with?
Friends.
Your friends. Okay. Your friends. So if you think about for a moment, anybody else you negotiate with? Do you find yourself negotiating with?
Your employees.
Your employees. So you negotiate up with your boss, you negotiate down with your employees, you negotiate sideways with your colleagues, your friends. We negotiate in every which way. If you were to make a ballpark estimate of how much of your time, if you think about your day, how much of your time you spend negotiating with your spouse, your children, your boss, your colleagues, your employees, your clients, drivers on the road, yourself, if you had to assign a percentage, what percentage of your time do you think you spend negotiating? What would you say? Anyone? 10%? Okay. Is anyone higher than that? 50%? 80%? Okay, how many of you say, I negotiate at least 10%? At least 10%. Okay. Keep your hands up if it's over 25%. Over 50%. Over 70%. So you can see that whatever the percentage is, it's a huge portion of our time. We don't always think of it formally as a negotiation, but at least in the informal sense, a back and forth communication trying to reach agreement. We are negotiating from the time we get up in the morning to the time we go to bed at night, not to speak of negotiating at night with ourselves during our dreams and so on. So it's a process we're continually engaged in. Now, if you think about the past 10 years, for example, as you perhaps advanced in your career, you've assumed more power, more authority, would you say that the amount of time that you spend negotiating is about the same as it was 10 years ago? Has it gone down over time, or has it gone up? What would you say? About the same? How many would say it's about the same? How many would say it's gone down over time? How many would say it's gone up over time? Take a look at the hands. That is, I think, a universal experience. And this is what I've found over the last 40 years wandering around the planet and traveling So the last few weeks I've been in Korea, I was in Colombia, I was in the United States, now here I'm in Scotland, many different continents. Whatever country I go to, I find that there's a revolution taking place around the world. And it's a quiet revolution. It accompanies the knowledge revolution. It accompanies the internet revolution. And it's a revolution in the way in which we as individuals, we as organizations, we as societies, the way in which we make decisions. Because traditionally, a generation or more ago, perhaps the most common form of decision-making was things were pretty much organized quite hierarchically, and the people on the top of the pyramids of power gave the orders, and the people on the bottom followed the orders. But now, increasingly, what we're finding is those pyramids of power beginning to collapse into organizations, organizational forms that more resemble networks, where essentially the basic form of decision-making is horizontal decision-making. It's moving from vertical towards horizontal decision-making. And another name for horizontal decision-making or shared decision-making is negotiation. Hence, why the great majority of hands go up, we're negotiating far more than we were ever before. We're having to negotiate across borders. We're having the complexity of it. We're perhaps the first generation to have to negotiate as much as we can. So we're in the infancy of trying to figure out, are there better ways to negotiate? Because in today's world, everyone wants to have a say. People don't want to be left behind. They want to have a say in decisions that affect them. And so the question is, how do we do that? So it requires a kind of creativity, the same kind of creativity that we put into better technologies like phones and smartphones. We need to put into the soft technologies of human relationship. How do we do that in today's world? That, to me, is one of the real challenges. Let me ask you one more question. Think about, you're all decision makers, you are leaders, really. Think about the 10 most important decisions you had to make in the course of the last year. How many of them could you make purely unilaterally, just by yourself? You make the decision. And how many of them did you actually have to reach with other people, with someone else, with other people, through some process of shared decision-making that we might call negotiation? Of the 10 most important decisions you had to make in the last year, how many of them, in effect, did you need to negotiate? What would you say? What would you say?
All of them.
All of them. How many would agree with that? Almost all of them, or all of them. So this is what we're dealing with, is that negotiation has become the preeminent form of making decisions. So the whole question is, how do we do it well? And it's not easy at all, of course. It's not easy. It's often extremely difficult. And how do we do this? How do we engage in this process? How do we learn to become better negotiators? You know, the thing that's always struck me is that if you were, since we negotiate maybe, some say 25% of our time, 50%, 75% of our time, if we were engaged in our favorite sport, be it golf, or be it swimming, or be it tennis, and we were engaged in 75% of our time, we might be in the Olympics. The question is, as good as we might be as negotiators, why aren't we all in the negotiation Olympics? And I think the answer to that question lies in the fact that when we negotiate, we put almost all of our attention on the outcome. What is the outcome? What is the agreement? What is, how much money? What are the terms of that agreement? When we engage in our favorite sport, we always have part of our attention focused on the process, on the swing, the golf swing, the tennis swing, our technique. And if we can learn to become what I would call reflective negotiators, in other words, negotiators who reflect, who are slightly detached, who are on the balcony, who are able to observe the play. It's almost like you're on the balcony and here you are, the negotiating is taking place on the stage. who can reflect on it, then we have a chance to learn. So that every single day we have so many chances to learn. So for me, a reflective negotiator is someone who's continually learning. I find myself continually learning every single day. That's what I strive to do. And that's what I think, that's the way to get into the negotiation Olympics, is through that reflective process, which is why it's so useful to have a day like we do have right now, which is a day on the balcony in which we can reflect on our own negotiations. So what I'd like to invite you to do, John has made up a piece of paper here. Where was it? There it is, right there. You have a piece of paper in front of you. And I'd like you, I think you're going to get a lot more value on the day if you can reflect on at least one challenging negotiation that you are currently facing. It could be a situation at home. It could be a situation at work. It could be a situation in the community. It could be a situation in the larger society. But if you think about it, there's some questions here. So I'd like you to just take a minute or two to fill out this sheet, the first two questions, which are, what difficult situation would you like help with? That's the first question. And what makes it difficult? What are the obstacles in the way? You wouldn't mind just taking a minute to fill out those first two questions on that sheet. I think you're going to get a lot more value out of the day as we talk about some general principles or specific techniques. If you have in mind one situation at least, maybe you'll pick more than one, but at least one situation, perhaps a situation you wouldn't mind sharing with a partner next to you, because I'd like us to have that chance to work through at least one situation, and I hope that by the end of the day, you'll have a better, maybe some different ideas, some different approaches about how to deal with that difficult situation. And I think it'll generate some interesting questions as well. So just take a second to fill out those first two questions. What's the situation and what makes it difficult? What's your negotiating situation? Think about it for a moment. Who are the parties? What's the issue? What's the tension between what you want and what they want? Okay. While some of you are finishing that, let me just ask you a question. If you could generalize and say there are two kinds of negotiations that we encounter in life. One are the external negotiations with people outside of the organization. Let's say it's clients, for example, or drivers on the road, or providers, or if you're negotiating with the government or banks, external negotiations. And the other are internal negotiations, inside the family, for example, with your spouse and children, or inside the organization with your colleagues, your boss, your employees. How many just out of curiosity, have selected an external negotiation as a challenging negotiation that you chose to focus on? You've taken an external negotiation. How many of you selected an internal negotiation? Okay. So interestingly, I would say there's obviously both have been selected, but there's quite a significant majority who selected internal situations, which leads me to the next question, which is, if you had to make a generalization, which of those two types of negotiations do you personally tend to find more challenging? The external negotiations or the internal negotiations? How many of you find external negotiations more challenging? How many of you find internal negotiations more challenging? Look around you. Now, isn't that interesting? Because The internal negotiations are with people with whom supposedly we're part of the same family, we're part of the same organization, we're part of the same team, and yet, paradoxically, those are often the most difficult negotiations. And so that, for example, if you take, I find, for example, those of us who are work in family businesses, for example, if you take the internal dynamics of a family and you superimpose them on the internal dynamics of a business, you can get some of the more complicated negotiations. And interestingly enough, what I find is if you ask yourself the question of what could possibly be more internal than yourself, in other words, there's this paradox of the more internal the negotiation, the more challenging sometimes it can be. Which is why, even if you look around the world today at conflicts, even the violent conflicts, the great majority of wars today take place within countries, not between countries. It's the ethnic wars, it's the civil wars. Those are the ones I find myself mostly working on. I just came back from working, I've been working for the last 7 years as an advisor, senior advisor to the president of Colombia, Juan Manuel Santos, taking a civil war that had bedeviled that country for 54 years. 54 years. There was hardly anyone alive who remembered what it was like to live in a time of peace. And I remember when he called me and first sat down, most people would have given maybe 5% odds that this war could come to an end. It just seemed so, so many attempts had been made, everything had always failed. And yet I watched and participated my last trip last week was my 25th trip to Colombia, was just watching and participating in this process of watching a seemingly absolutely impossible, intractable conflict tied up with drugs, kidnapping, 250,000 people dead, 8 million victims of this conflict. No family in Colombia was untouched by this conflict. And to watch it slowly, patiently, with so many setbacks, so many failures, move to the point where last year the guerrillas, the FARC, finally laid down their weapons and are now entering the field of politics. And it seemed impossible. Now we're in the middle of the implementation of that agreement. And this is one thing I've learned too about negotiation, is that we think negotiation comes to an end when you reach an agreement. But actually that's only the midpoint of the negotiation, because there's the entire implementation of that agreement, and oftentimes agreements, I find, they break down during the implementation phase. And now Colombia is struggling with that implementation process of how do you implement, how do you put an end to a war that's been going on for 54 years? It might take a generation to really heal the wounds and to really start to integrate them. So we're talking about things that are extremely difficult, but it's the internal negotiations that are often most difficult. And interestingly, in that conflict, what I found universally is that however difficult it was for the government to negotiate with the FARC guerrillas, and I went to meet both sides and spent time with them, the most difficult thing was the negotiations inside the government. They were more difficult than negotiating at the table with the FARC. And the same thing I would say from the FARC. Oftentimes, it's the internal negotiations. So however difficult it is, I think, for example, the UK to negotiate with Europe around Brexit, it's the internal negotiations within the UK government that are even more difficult than dealing with the Europeans. And so we're dealing with that challenge. So today we'll talk about both internal and external, but it is interesting that the more internal, the more difficult, which is why the theme this morning is dealing with the most internal of all negotiations, which I find is that if we can be successful in that, in getting to yes with our own selves, it will facilitate our ability to get to yes with others. It will facilitate our ability to help others get to yes if we're mediators. So that's the key to me, is the first and most important negotiation that we ever have to deal with is the one that starts within. That's the key. And it's a long time coming, because I've specialized in dealing with difficult negotiations, because I was based at Harvard and writing about negotiation, but I wanted to get real life experience, so I've used the world as my laboratory, wandering around the world to the most difficult situations, working on the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, in the Middle East, the Israelis and the Palestinians. I worked in Syria, I worked in Chechnya, I worked in Yugoslavia, I worked, just seeking out the most difficult situations to see what works, what doesn't work, what makes these things so difficult, and how do we possibly overcome what are seemingly intractable differences. So the key is, what I found is that if we can get to an inner yes inside of ourselves as negotiators, as mediators, then that's what facilitates the outer yes. So what I'd like to do is just talk with you a little bit about that process. I mean, John was just mentioning Nelson Mandela, who, to my mind, is one of the great negotiators of the last generation, really enormous. But he didn't start off as a natural negotiator. He was a boxer. And he was a fighter. But when he went into prison and spent 27 years in prison, he writes about it. He started to write and talk about how the most difficult negotiation he had was inside of himself, to try to learn to control his own natural tendency for anger, for reaction. And what did he do in that jail? He learned about himself. He did what Adam Smith called on us to do, which is to know yourself, to know your own reactions, to go to the balcony, to observe your own natural reactions. And what's the first thing he did when he was in prison, besides that, is he started to learn the language of his enemies. He learned Afrikaans, the language of his jailers. He learned the history of the Boer people, of the Boer War. He learned their trauma, and all of that served him enormously by learning to get to yes with himself. Then when he emerged from jail 27 years later, he was able much more effectively then to speak to his enemies in their own language, knowing their own history, evoking their own traumas, and was able successfully to persuade them to bring apartheid to an end. He wasn't a natural negotiator. Another one from the world of business is Steve Jobs. As you know, he was a very volatile character who reinvented really the world of technology, everything that we have today. And he was also just but he early on, he founded Apple Computers, and then because of his kind of wild, impulsive behavior, he was expelled from Apple Computer. He was expelled, as you may know his story, and he spent many years kind of in the wilderness, but he spent time learning about himself during that time, taking long walks. He liked to walk, and when he came back to Apple Computer 10 years later, he was still, we still have the same kind of personality quirks, but he knew himself more. He knew himself more, such that Apple Computer was then in a very precarious state. It was about to go under. And the only way he could save Apple Computer was to make an alliance with his erstwhile enemy, his opponent, who was Bill Gates of Microsoft. And they were kind of like bitter rivals. But he went to Bill Gates and asked Bill Gates to invest in the new Apple. And particularly, he asked him to develop a form of Microsoft Office for Apple, which was something they weren't interested in doing. And only by doing that was he able to rescue Apple. So, and I remember that he had a meeting. There was a meeting in which all the Apple people were there, and he brought in Bill Gates by video conference, and everyone booed, Bill Gates, Microsoft was the enemy. He said, no. He said, look, for Apple to win doesn't mean that Microsoft has to lose. He shifted, he reframed the game from a win-lose contest to both could benefit, to the point that, that they became friends, actually. They became friends, rather than enemies, because he had done that internal work of getting to yes for himself. That's the key. So essentially, as I try to think about it, I'd like to, I'm known, getting yes is known for, something called interest-based negotiation. What I like to propose is to go one step beyond interest-based negotiation, which includes interest-based negotiation. And think of it as balcony-based negotiation for a moment. What does it mean to negotiate from the balcony? What does it mean to negotiate from a place of calm and perspective where you can keep your eyes on the prize? Which is something, as Mandela did, which is to, a South Africa that would work for people of all races. As Steve Jobs did, which was, okay, even if we're business rivals, we can still find ways to cooperate. How can we work together in this new technological revolution? And so essentially what I'd like to do is just propose a little bit of a framework here, where you start with negotiating with yourself, which then allows you to negotiate with the other. So you start here with yourself, negotiate with the other. And you start here with a shift in mindset. That's what we're talking about, is an initial shift in our mindset, our underlying assumptions, which then leads us to a conversation about interest-based negotiation, which then leads to options. And so I'd like to take us through these 6 steps, as it were, and as I do so, I would like to invite you to take your own situations as we go along this little journey and apply this framework to your own situations to see if we might get some insights into your own situation. Before we do that, actually, what I'd like to do, if I might, just because I want to make today as tailored to your needs as possible, is with your own situations in mind, what I'd like to do is make a quick list of questions that you might have. What are the obstacles? When you wrote down what makes your negotiation difficult, what were the kinds of things that you came up with? Just so that I have those in mind so that I can weave them through the course of the morning here. What are the biggest obstacles that you see to success in your own negotiations? If I could just make a quick list. If you could just call out a word or 2 words or 3 words, so you kind of get a sense. What is it? Time. Okay. So time is one. Expectations is another. Different priorities. Anxiety. Relationships. Access to the right people. Power place. I'm sorry? Facilities? Hostilities. Hostilities, of course, yeah. Kind of emotional hostilities, okay. Culture. Lack of clear communication. Psychology. Not knowing what they want. What actually do they want? I'm sorry? Differences in values. Okay. So it's not just differences in interests, it's differences in values. Trust. There's distrust. Lack of trust. Very common. Difficult negotiation.
Fear of displacement.
There's fear of displacement. Okay, fear of displacement. Dealing with irrational people. Okay. That's good. Well, what was that? Power imbalance. Okay. Those are good. Okay, that gives me a good sense then. we'll try and also we'll have time for questions, and particularly this afternoon, but even today during the morning. I want to make this as interactive as possible and really address your concerns. Okay, so let's start off with balcony for a moment. So the whole idea of the balcony is that in balcony-based negotiation here for a moment, and we'll just take that. The challenge is, the biggest obstacle, of course, to getting what we want in negotiation turns out to be ourselves. It's our natural tendency to react, to act without thinking. And the truth is that we can't, if negotiation is about influence, we don't have a hope of a whisper of a chance of being able to influence the other if we're first not able to influence ourselves. That's the key, is that mastery begins with self-mastery. If we can't master ourselves, it's going to be very hard to master others. If I might just give an example from some of my negotiations. Many years ago, I was involved as a mediator, as a third party, between the government of Russia and the government of Chechnya. And they're involved in a terrible civil war, as you remember. And we had the very first meeting between the two sides in The Hague, in the Peace Palace there in The Hague. In fact, in the very room where this was back in the mid-90s, where the war crimes tribunal was taking place for Yugoslavia. And the person representing Chechnya happened to be the vice president of Chechnya. And the negotiations got off to a very bad start, because when the Chechen delegation took off from their capital, Grozny, they were, as they tried to fly over Russia, they were surrounded by Soviet MiGs who threatened to shoot the plane down. So when they arrived, they were in a rather disgruntled mood. And the vice president of Chechnya began the conversation. At the table there, he said, and he pointed to the Russians, and he said, "You should stay right here in this room because you're going to be on trial for war crimes." And then he began a whole long, perhaps hour-long disquisition on the whole history of the traumas of the sufferings of the Chechen people at the hands of the Russians going back at least 3 centuries. And the whole history, and accusation after accusation. And then he noticed me. He said, "Oh, you're an American. Let me tell you what you Americans are doing. First of all, you're supporting the Russians." He said, President Clinton is supporting Boris Yeltsin. He said, "But I want to tell you what you're doing in Puerto Rico." And he went on about Puerto Rico and how the Americans were oppressing the people of Puerto Rico for at least 10 minutes. And then he turned to me for reply, and everyone, all the eyes of the 30 people around the room sort of looked to me, and I was trying to think, what do I know about Puerto Rico? What exactly are we doing in Puerto Rico? It's very easy to kind of lose, because he was he's criticizing, so it was very easy. But then I somehow remembered to go to the balcony and remember the thing that you're supposed to remember, which is, why are we here? And so I had from the balcony perspective, and the translation gave me a little bit of time to think for a moment, and that's what's in such short supply in negotiation, is time to think. And I said, I understand, I hear you, I hear the suffering of the Chechen people, I hear the whole story. And as to Puerto Rico, I'm glad to hear you. I take your criticism of my country as a sign that we're among friends, because only friends can really criticize each other and tell each other the truth, and I appreciate that. But we're here to try to stop the suffering of the Chechen people. And I kind of moved the spotlight right back from Puerto Rico back to the Chechen situation, and then we began to talk about how to bring about a ceasefire, which eventually came about a few days later. But it was just, to me, it was an example of how easy it was. Because my mind was going to Puerto Rico, and what do I know about Puerto Rico? But that's often what we're doing in negotiation. Is you're talking, a husband and a wife are getting into an argument, and it goes off in a totally different direction. And it's so easy in negotiation, I find, to lose sight of what the prize is. What actually is the prize? What are you trying to get at? And that's what I find is so important about ways to go to the balcony, whether it's on the spot. It's so easy, even though negotiation is supposed to be rational, goal-oriented behavior. What I often find is people act in ways that go directly contrary to their own interests. Because we get deviated, we get into point scoring, and we forget what the actual issue is about. And that's the importance of being able to go to the balcony. So let me just ask you, if I may, think about it for a moment in terms of there are natural reactions when we're in a difficult situation. One is to fight back or respond in kind. Very, very common reaction. When you are attacked, we tend to attack back. And as as Mahatma Gandhi once said, an eye for an eye, and we all go blind. And that's what often happens in negotiations. Or we might, get so upset we just break off and walk away. And if that's our client, if that's our boss, if that's our spouse, and we just walk away, maybe that doesn't actually solve the problem either, although a very natural human reaction. Or a third very natural reaction is we give in, we just accommodate. But that, of course, doesn't serve our interests either. So the natural human reactions of fight, flight, or give in, surrender, usually do not serve our own interests. So the question is, how can we go to the balcony and think proactively? What's a proper response that advances our own interests in the negotiation? That turns out to be the key. The key is this ability to go to the balcony, to imagine that we're negotiating on stage, and go to a mental and emotional balcony, which is a place of perspective, a place of calm, a place of self-control. It's a place where we can keep our eyes on the prize. I mean, if you think about it even in physiological terms, and I notice this in the world today as I travel around the world. This last year, last about 15 months, I've touched into the whole issue of Brexit, which is an extremely complicated negotiation. We went from there to Catalonia, which of course involved another whole mess, and went from there to Colombia, and then went from there to the Middle East, and then went from there to Myanmar, and Korea, and dealt with Russia, and then dealt with Iran. And everywhere I go, there's so much polarization. The levels of anger and outrage and fear are so high that what you find is people are go into a hyperstate of stimulation where the sympathetic system, the nervous system gets so excited. And, in my own country now, with the people who are against President Trump and the people who are fervent supporters of President Trump, there's so much, our nerves, everyone's nerves are on edge. And so we go into a hyperstate. And then you can't sustain that. And so a lot of people then descend into a hypostate, which is paralysis, resignation, numbness. There's just too much going on. Whether it's, as John was mentioning with climate change, people get sometimes very excited about climate change, the world is really changing, extreme weather and so on. Or we go into, it's just too much, I can't do anything about it, and we just go into hypo. In negotiation, the most effective place to be in our nervous systems is in between here, is psychologists call the optimal zone, or the zone of tolerance, it's sometimes called. And actually, in the nervous system, it's There's a nerve called the vagal nerve that actually calms us down, brings us back. Where you're neither hyper, not hypo. Yes, we have normal emotions. Yes, we have anger. Yes, we have fear. Yes, we have anxiety. But they're within certain tolerable levels that we can use them. Emotions are enormously important. This is not about suppressing your emotions, because emotions are information. They give us critical information about our environment. We need to learn to read our emotions. But if we let our emotions get out of control, then our emotions are controlling us instead of us controlling our emotions. So it's important to have those emotions. We need those emotions to really be able to read our environment. They often tell us when things are wrong. I mean, how do you know, for example, if someone is lying to you in a negotiation? Is you get this feeling in your gut. It's kind of almost like a physical feeling, like there's something off here. So we don't want to disconnect ourselves from our bodies and from our emotions, which are extremely important sources of information. But from a balcony perspective, it's the ability to read our own emotions. But if we're in the hyper state or the hypo state, we're no longer, we've lost contact with our emotions. We're just kind of in a state of apathy, as it were. And you find this collectively. If you look at our collective, there's so much apathy in the world today. And there's so much hyperstimulation. And the internet plays this role of, because all the times now you get this news, this traumatic, all this Syria, what's going on here, what's going on there, and then you just close down. So you're either hyper or hypo. And our ability to manage our own emotions so that we can stay in an optimal state, which is a state where you can actually act effectively, where you can listen to your own emotions, where you can listen to the other side's emotions, where you can tolerate ambiguity. It's that middle zone that we need to learn to cultivate. And as leaders, we need to learn to lead our organizations and our societies to help them stay within that optimal zone, because that's the zone where you can effectively deal with issues and deal with problems. And that, to me, is one of the great challenges, which is why balcony-based negotiation turns out to be so key. So let me just ask you, if I may, what are your favorite ways to go to the balcony? If you wouldn't mind just writing down for a moment. Write down one or two, or perhaps three. What are your favorite ways in the course of the day? How do you bring yourself into that optimal zone? How do you like to calm yourself so that you are at your best? You are in the zone, what athletes call the zone. When you're the best, you can give your best performance in a particular negotiation. You can show up at your best. What do you do? Everyone has their favorite techniques. If you just write down one or two or three of them to think about what you might use in your own particular situation, the one you just mentioned. What are your favorite balcony techniques? Just write down one or two techniques that work for you, because what works for you may not be what worked for someone else. And then let me just see if you wouldn't mind just calling out a few of them, just to see what the variety of methods are. For me, for example, if I might just add one thing I love to do is to go for a walk. I love to go for walks, particularly in nature. And here, Edinburgh, I've noticed, is like one of the most beautiful cities, so with the meadows and the gorse. It's just like, it lends itself. I'm not surprised that the Scottish Enlightenment took place here, because there's such a rich combination of urban community and the beauty of nature. What do you use to kind of calm yourself down when you're in a difficult negotiation? You swim. Okay, so this is some kind of activity, swimming. Music is another thing. Just gives you into a different modality, for sure. What else? Meditation. Yeah, meditation, just taking a moment, silence, just silencing yourself. I find that very useful too. Before I go into a negotiation, just take a few minutes of silence, just to calm my mind down, calm my emotions down, remember what's important?
Breathing.
Breathing, absolutely, because what does breathing do? Because essentially, when we get into the hyper state, particularly, you know, the blood tends to flow out of our brain to our extremities because we got to be ready to fight or flight. Breathing brings oxygen back, allows it, calms us down, calms down the sympathetic system, activates the vagal nerve. What else can do? What else do you do? Excuse me? Make a cup of tea. Exactly, a cup of tea. Being grateful. Absolutely, yeah. Being grateful just kind of calms you down. What else?
Journaling.
Journaling, exactly. Writing them down, giving the expression to those emotions. But when you journal, you're actually putting yourself some distance between that. You're putting it down on paper, so you're putting yourself on the balcony. You become that witness that Adam Smith was talking about. You witness you become the observer of your own reactions, the observer of your own emotions. Squeezing putty, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Something like that. Exactly. Something physical like that. You know, I was saying when we were in the Scottish Parliament, I was telling a story about how I was in a meeting with President Chavez once in Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and he was shouting at me and just like for about 30 minutes, this absolutely, you know, in front of his entire cabinet, and I remembered something physical that someone had taught me, which was to pinch the palm of my hand. And this fellow, Hernando, said, just pinch the palm of your hand. I said, why, Hernando? He said, because it'll give you a momentary pain, it'll keep you alert, you know. Just something physical like that to remind you of your body, to embody yourself, can kind of bring you, can ground you, can center you. Yeah. What else?
Reaching out to someone who can listen well.
There you go. Use someone else as your balcony. You know, it's interesting because I often, sometimes have trained hostage negotiators. You know, the hostage negotiators who deal with, like in big cities, deal with hostage situations. They never negotiate alone because it's so easy to get emotionally identified with the situation. They always have a partner or other people who can serve as their balcony, who can kind of say, hey, you're getting a little bit off. You know, so listen, someone who can listen to you and help you calm down, can serve as your balcony. You know, it's interesting in this situation in Colombia with President Santos. He once said that to me. He said, there was myself and there were a few other advisors. He said, you are my balcony. You know, you can listen to me. You pay attention to me. Because everyone else is coming at me all the time. So when he's trying to negotiate an end to this war, he needed such people to listen to him. What other techniques do you have? Those are good. Humor, of course, yeah. Humor absolutely can kind of like just take it can shift the mood, you know. Humor, absolutely, in a good situation like that. Yeah. So there are many, many ways to just kind of like just change perspective. That's what it's, you know, psychologists call perspective taking. Just change our perspective, which help us go to the balcony. Okay, so then from the balcony for a moment, the next step here is from the balcony, from that mindset. Now we can do something, you know, in negotiation we talk a lot about, you know, perhaps when people ask me what's the most important skill of a negotiator, you know, I always say, you know, it's the ability to put yourself in the other side's shoes, because after all, negotiation is an exercise in influence. You're trying to change someone's mind. How can you possibly change their mind unless you know where that mind is put yourself in their shoes. But what I found is it's actually hard for us to put ourselves in the other side's shoes. It's actually difficult to do that, particularly in a very difficult situation like the ones that we face. And the key prerequisite to being able to put yourself in the other side's shoes is first, oddly enough, to put yourself in your own shoes. And that's the key to me in negotiation, is to put yourself in your own shoes. And that's what you do on the balcony, is, as Adam Smith does, you learn to observe yourself by journaling. You learn to put yourself in your own shoes. What am I feeling? What's going on inside me? You know, when President Chavez was shouting at me during that time, my instinct, my reaction was to defend myself. He was saying, "You're naive. You third parties are not seeing all the crazy tricks those traders are up to," and so on. He was just like furious, leaning very close in my face. But then I was able to put myself in my own shoes and say, I'm noticing. What am I noticing? I'm noticing my cheeks are reddening here. I'm thinking, okay, a year and a half work down the drain. Feeling embarrassed. I'm feeling a little anxious. I'm feeling like reacting, like, no, I'm not naive, and so on. But by essentially putting myself in my own shoes, noticing my own emotions, then instead of my emotions controlling me, I could begin to control my own emotions. And then I could settle down and just listen to him, bite my tongue and listen to him. And by doing that, by just listening to him for about 30 minutes, and this was a man who was known for giving speeches for 8 hours, and I'm sure he could have given a speech for 8 hours. After 30 minutes of of just paying attention to what's going on inside of me, by listening to myself, I was better able to listen to him. And then after about 30 minutes, he began to run out of steam, and his shoulders sank, and he said, at the end of it, he said, "So, Ury, what should I do?" So, his mood shifted. And that's the key, is one of the greatest powers we have in negotiation is the power not to react. That's the ability to go to the balcony. So that's what you want to do. Now, what you want to do from the balcony, put yourself in your own shoes, is to really focus on what's truly important. Someone mentioned values. What are your true values in a negotiation? So what I'd like to do for a moment here is just ask you for a moment to close your eyes for a second. Just close your eyes and point your arm in the direction that you think north is. Where's north for you right now? Just close your eyes, point your arm where north is, okay? Now, keep your arm up and open your eyes, and you'll see that everyone is pointing in very, very different directions. Look at this. Some people are pointing this way, some people are pointing that way, some people are pointing that way, and I'm just looking at my compass here, and north is over here. Now, that is an illustration of just how easy it is to get disoriented in negotiation. We don't know where our own true north is. Our own true north, where our values are. How do we orient ourselves? That's what happens, is we get disoriented. And the whole idea here in negotiation is because we need to stay rooted in what's important to us. Let me give you an example, if I may. A few years ago, I got a call from a woman who was a very prominent entrepreneur in Brazil, and she said, "Could you help my father? He is perhaps the most prominent, best-known businessman in Brazil. He's 75 years old. He and his father started with a little bakery, a little Portuguese bakery in São Paulo, Brazil, and they built it into the largest supermarket chain, not only in Brazil, but the largest retailer in all of Latin America. Extremely successful. And they made a partnership with a French supermarket king. It was a company called Casino, which is a big French supermarket thing. And they're having this huge boardroom battle about control of the company. And it's been going on for 3 years. It's all over the papers. They've hired just about every law firm you can imagine in London, in São Paulo, in New York. They're fighting this out in the courts. They were literally spending I believe, tens of millions of dollars fighting each other. I mean, that's how it was. There was character assassination. There was corporate espionage. People were telling me they were afraid for their lives and so on. This thing had gotten so out of control. I mean, the president of Brazil was speaking about it with the president of France. It strained Franco-Brazilian relations, and she said, "Could you help?" And I thought, well, I don't know if I can help. I mean, I'm not usually doing these kind of commercial things, but I said, next time I come to Sao Paulo in a month or two, I'd be happy to at least meet with your father. And so I met with him. His name is William Ury, and I went to his home, and he was 76 at the time. He'd married again. He had young children who were just running around, 2 young children. One was 5, one was 3 or 6 or whatever. Anyway, they were, and I thought to myself, wow, their father is just consumed with this conflict. What kind of father can he be to these kids and so on? And but I asked him this question, because for me it's all about balcony, like can we go to the balcony here? Because here's a company with 150,000 employees. We provided loyalties. The thing was just blown completely out of proportion. The Financial Times said this was perhaps the largest cross-continental boardroom dispute in history. I mean, it was really kind of like it was shaking so I asked him. I said, from a balcony perspective, I said, so Abilio, tell me, what is it that you want? What are your interests? What is it you want? And like a very smart, intelligent, very, very successful businessman, he said, I know exactly what I want. I want, $1 billion in cash, and I want the company headquarters, and there's a non-compete clause in the contract for 3 years, and I want it eliminated. I want the company headquarters. And we had about like 6 things. Those are his demands, which is how we usually approach a negotiation. These are our demands. And lawyers have been going at it for 18 months trying to negotiate, got nowhere. And so then I said to him, but Abilio, you're a man who seems to have everything. You've got your own private plane, you fly around the world, you're a millionaire, I mean, you can have any life you want. What do you really want? What do you want with your life? I mean, after all, what do you want? I mean, behind all of that, what's the prize? In your shoes, from a balcony perspective, what really matters to you? And he paused and he struggled with that question, and finally he said, you know what I want, William? He said, I want liberdade, which in Portuguese means I want freedom. I want my freedom. That's what I want. And I could tell it by the tone. It wasn't the same tone as I want $1 billion or I want the end of the non-compete clause. I want liberdade. I want my freedom. And for him, I knew, because I had studied his history, that had a particular resonance because 20, perhaps 30 years earlier, he had been leaving his apartment, the garage, coming out of the garage, and was surrounded by cars, and he was a man who was a fighter. He was a boxer, and he even had a gun and whatever, but he was surrounded by kidnappers who were urban guerrillas who took him hostage, and they held him in a coffin for an entire week with just some air holes in it. And this is a man who prized control, and he loved control. So you can imagine being held in a coffin. Probably he never even survived being held in this kind of coffin, and only by pure chance, pure divine grace, did somehow the police find that. I found an abandoned vehicle, and somewhere in the car engine they found a business card, and the business card was for a garage. And they went to the garage, and then they were able to track it down. They were able to find the place, and they were able to free him after a week, which he attributed to the intercession of Santa Rita, who's the saint of impossible causes. Anyway, he was free, but I knew that freedom for him had a particular resonance because he was feeling like a hostage of this situation, an emotional hostage of this conflict, which had consumed his life for 3 years. Every board meeting was just a shouting match. And so freedom, as soon as I heard the word freedom from them, I thought, you know what, maybe I could help them. I said, Ophelia, I don't know if I can get you your $1 billion. I don't know if I can get you all that stuff. I'm not even a trained lawyer. I mean, whatever it was, I said, I don't know if I can do, but maybe I can help you get what you most want, which is your freedom, your psychological, emotional freedom. And I asked him, what would you do with your freedom? What would you do with your freedom? And he said, well, if I was free, I would spend more time with my family, which is the most important thing to me. And he pointed to his kids. His wife was there. His older kids were there, too. They came for lunch. He said, I'd spend more time with my family. And then I would also do what I love to do, which is I love to jet around the world and make big deals and mergers and things like that. That's what I would do if I was free. So then I decided to take on the case to see if I could help him. But what was interesting to me was the key there was I was helping him. I was on the balcony. I was helping him go to a balcony because he was so in a reactive state of fighting, thinking he had to fight. I remember once he said to me, maybe it's just my life. I just have to fight for the rest of my life because he was going to be chairman of this company for another 8 years until he was 84. It was just going to be another 8 years of fighting. And I said, well, maybe that's my fate, is just to fight. And the question is, was there an alternative here? Did they have to live with all that damage, not just damage to him and to his family, but to 150,000 employees, to commercial relations between these two countries and so on? Not to speak of all the money that was being wasted in this gigantic struggle between lawyers. And so it was freedom. So my question for you is, in your own situation, go back to your own situation for a moment, is in the difficult situation you just picked, what is it that you want? Someone mentioned, sometimes I don't know what the other side wants. I think the first thing is to know, what do you want? What do you really want? What is your objective? I can see Theresa May, for example, just as an example. What does she want? Or what does the UK actually want in the Brexit negotiation? What's the #1 objective? What is it they really want? So I'm asking you, in your own situation, what do you really want? What's the equivalent of freedom for you? What's the root value? What's the root deed? If you had to put it down in a word or two, what do you most want in that situation that you're currently faced with? So just take a moment and write that down if you would. What do you really want? What is behind everything? What is it you really want? What would it look like if you got what you want? Just to see if you can get an image of it. Because this is something I find so often in negotiation is, like my good friend Emilio, he thought he knew what he wanted. It was about money and non-compete clause and the company headquarters, the concrete things. But behind that, what did he really want in life? What was truly important to him? What had deep emotional resonance? What was he really fighting for? What did he most want? So I'm asking you that same question. Here I find that one of the magical questions you can ask yourself is why. Why do you want that? It's keep on. It's almost like layers, like geological layers of what is it that you really want? What's at the bottom of it? If there's some basic need, what do you really want? If you wouldn't mind calling out just to kind of get a sense of what's that one word for you, just to kind of get a sense from you again. What's your core want in your situation, would you say, if you had to sum it up in a word or two? Harmony. Okay, so you really want harmony. Okay, that's what you want. What else comes to mind? Partnership. A clear conscience. Excuse me? Stability. Security. Yeah. These are basic human needs. Security, stability, a clear conscience. Simply to be. Okay, so you're getting down into the ground. Because the thing is, what I find is that the more we can root ourselves in the depth of what we want, that's actually give us more strength than to be able to go for what we want. It's almost like a tree. Sometimes we stay up sometimes in the branches of the tree or the trunk of the tree. We have to get down into the roots of what we want. The stronger the roots, the stronger the tree. What else did you come up with?
Making a difference.
Confidence. Sorry? Making a difference. Okay, so exactly. So I think rooting ourselves in that turns out to be absolutely key. I remember, just even in a commercial situation, I remember once talking with a fellow who was a vice president of a software company. And he said his hardest thing was dealing with clients. And clients were always asking for customized software solutions. And it always ended up taking a lot of money and a lot of things and just making the thing unprofitable. He couldn't bring himself to say no to an important customer. And so I said, so why is it that you're saying no? What's the reason? What's your prize here? What's your underlying interest? He said, well, revenue. We need to preserve revenue. That's why I need to say no. And I said, but revenue just didn't strike me as deep enough. So I said, so why do you want more revenue? And he was kind of shocked. I said, well, we need to make a profit. He thought that was the end of the conversation. I said, so, well, why do you want to make a profit? And he said, well, so the company can survive. And I said, well, why do you want the company to survive? And then he pointed to everyone in the room and said, so we can have jobs. And I said, well, why do you want to have a job? He said, so I could put food on my family's table. And I thought, okay, now we got down to, it's kind of it's like excavating. I said, the next time you're with that client, and the client asks you to customize, think, I've got to put food on my family's table. That's going to give you a certain strength that you're going to need to be able to say no, because in negotiation, it's not just about getting to yes, you also have to be able to say no. Not just about to get to the right solutions, to get to the right yeses, we have to say no to the wrong solutions in this case, and to be able to say no because I'm putting food on my family's table. That would give him the strength to say no, and instead then offer the customer, look, there's an off-the-shelf solution here that we can adapt and we can tailor to your needs. And that's what helped him, and I think that's what we all need to do. It's like my friend Emilio, we have to go beyond what we say we want to really ask the question of what is it that we really want? Because that's the purpose of negotiation. The purpose of negotiation is to go for what you really want. And if we can really get to that, you know, listening to Teresa Sturgeon, Nicholas Sturgeon. Oh yeah, Theresa May. That's a good slip right there. Yeah. Nicholas Sturgeon the other day, you know, it was like, when I was listening to her, I could see, you know, but there's something about, the surface thing is we want independence, right? But why do you want independence? Why do you want independence? It's something to do with self-determination, the ability to shape your own destiny, the ability to have a voice, to really kind of try to go behind what people say they want. For what is that deep human? Everybody wants to be able to shape their own destiny. They want to be able to have a voice. There's something about dignity in there. So you kind of really listen behind the layers of what people say, because, you know, independence. You know, I remember once many years ago, I was sitting down with a guerrilla group that had been fighting for 25 years for the independence of Aceh, which is a province of Indonesia. It's a place where the tsunami actually hit most strongly. And this was before the tsunami. And I was meeting with all their leaders who've been fighting for 25 years, thousands of people dead and whatever. And I said, so what do you want? And they said, well, we want independence. That's what we want. That's what we've been fighting for. And I said, I understand that. I said that you've been fighting, and what do you think the chances of you getting independence are with the Indonesian army being as strong as they are? They said, well, no, they could see that, you know, they weren't going to get it anytime soon. It might be 10 years. I said, so, but tell me strategically, why do you want independence? Why do you want independence? Why are you fighting for independence? And there was a kind of a stunned silence around the table with all these leaders. And I realized that here they were fighting for something, but they couldn't quite answer why they were fighting for it. Because I said, are you fighting for, do you want your own parliament? Do you want, the political autonomy? Is it economic control of your natural resources? Do you want a seat at the UN? Why do you want the independence? And they struggled with that question, but then as we kind of shaped it and I brought out what their underlying interests were, they realized that then that actually began a conversation that they had not had as a movement, which was recognizing that for them in that particular situation, strategically, what would best serve them, recognizing that militarily they were highly unlikely to achieve their goal of independence. I said, don't surrender your goal of independence. Don't surrender your goal of independence, but how do you advance your underlying interests in self-determination, in being able to affect the fate for your own people? They wanted cultural independence, but to be able to put children in their own language, to practice their religion the way they wanted to practice it, and so on. That's what they wanted. And so they had this big debate within the movement around whether or not to carry on the armed struggle or whether or not to try to do it through democratic autonomy. And they were then, a number of years later, finally able to negotiate that. They had a vote, a democratic vote within the province, and the governor and the vice governor turned out to be leaders of this of the movement. They didn't have to abandon their long-term objective of independence, but they actually moved, they advanced, they got economic control over their natural and oil gas resources off their coast, they got political autonomy, they got a lot of cultural autonomy and so on. And they moved in the direction of what their strategic objectives were without having to surrender what their long-term objective was. They could move along that continuum. And I think that's why it's so important to be able to go to the balcony, put yourself in your shoes, and understand what your real interests are here, because negotiation isn't always about advancing your position. You know, independence was a position, but what's the interest behind it? What are the core human needs of dignity, of voice that need to be advanced? How do we do that today and tomorrow without even, without abandoning anything, but just how do we move in that direction? Given the strength, the leverage that we have, what can we do to move in that direction? That turned out to be the key for them. So that's the core of keeping asking yourself. Sometimes I find it, ask yourself 5 times, why? Why do I want that? Why do I want that? Until you get to that bottom layer, which a lot of you did for your own situation. That's the key. So then, let me come to the third thing, which is, okay, so where does the power come from in order to be able to advance and secure and protect your core interests of confidence, of stability, of security? Where does the power come from in negotiation? Now, as we know, a key concept here is a concept, an acronym that Roger Fisher and I coined many years ago, getting ES called your BATNA, which is that power comes from many things, of course, but perhaps the greatest source of power is the power of having a good BATNA. Your BATNA, as you recall, is just an acronym standing for your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. In other words, it's like a fork in the road. Either you go towards agreement or you go towards your BATNA, which is your best course of action, if for some reason you are not able to reach agreement. And it turns out that one of the great mistakes we make in negotiations, we go into negotiation, we just try to go for agreement, and we haven't really thought through what our BATNA is. What are we going to do if for some reason we are not able to reach agreement in that difficult situation that we all face? Because BATNA turns out to be a source of power, a source of confidence. Because if you have an alternative, then you are not the hostage of the other side. You're not desperate to reach an agreement with them because you have an alternative. And oftentimes that alternative can be improved. Just give you an example. There was a Zen master conducting a class in Zen Buddhism, and they often teach with kind of paradox. So there was a student there in the class, and he was sipping a cup of tea, and the Zen master came along with a big stick and said to this student, he said, "If you drink that cup of tea, I will beat you with a stick. And if you do not drink that cup of tea, I will beat you with a stick." Now you're the student. What do? How many of you thought, I'll drink the cup of tea anyway, right? How many of you had that idea passed you through your head, right? Okay, that's one of the typical responses to superior power. If you have no control, you might as well enjoy the tea, right? And probably the second most common one is, I'll fight back, right? How many of you had the thought, I'd fight back if someone's about to hit me with a stick, right? So that's the second. But those are two. Those are two BATNAs in that situation. But what else could you do? What else could you do in that situation? Yes, in the back, Fiona.
Offer him the cup of tea.
Offer him the cup of tea. Okay. What else could you do? You could take the stick Now see, that taking the stick is an interesting idea because you could just kind of grab the stick, because that's essentially, if you think about these as classes of behavior, taking the stick isn't necessarily being aggressive, you're just removing their ability to hurt you, right? You can take the stick. So for example, I don't know, if for example you were selling something and you have a client, for example, and the client is always asking you to cut the price and whatever, and the client's stick is, if you don't give me what you want, I know your boss, I play golf with them, and that's their stick. What you can do is you can meet with the boss beforehand and you say, look, I've been to this movie before, this is what happens, I try to hold the line, and then he comes to you. And so if you want to have that client, you can deal with that client, but if you want me to deal with a client, send the client back to me. Then when the customer pulls out that stick and says, I know your boss, you can say, please, feel free to call the boss, knowing your boss is going to back you up. You've just removed the client's stick. That's one possibility. What else could you do in that situation?
Ask them why.
Ask them why. Why they want to beat you, right? What else could you do? You could pour the tea away. Okay. What else could you do? What else could you do in a situation like that?
You could legal them. You could invoke hierarchy and invoke justification.
So involve
legal
thing. You could threaten to sue them, maybe. Okay. Some kind of legal. What else could you do? You could laugh at them. What else?
Share the tea.
You could share the tea.
Ask him what he wants.
You could ask him what he wants. What else could you do? You could throw the tea at him in his face. What else could you do in a situation? Remember, this is a situation we often face. How many of you face situations of asymmetrical power, where you have less power than the other? Okay, so it's very common. Okay, so what else could you do? You could what?
Spit on the stick.
I'm sorry?
Spit on the stick.
Spit on the stick. Okay. You can what? Leave the room. Okay, exit. Exit is one thing we should always consider is what's our exit strategy? Run. Exit. You can exit the situation. That's a classic way. Okay, we can exit the situation. We can remove ourselves from the danger. Okay. What else could you do? That's just that. What else could you do? Anything else? Yes, please, in the back.
You could form partnerships with other people and kind of...
Right. Absolutely. This is what I was looking for, which is like, I think it's interestingly, in a situation, okay, great, wonderful. Thank you. So what you could do is ally yourself. Remember, you're a student and there are all these other people in the room. The master is more powerful with a stick than the individual student. But if you say, help me, fellow students, solidarity, suddenly you have a mass of students, and the students are more powerful than the master. You can form a coalition. And that's something that I think we ought to think of doing sometimes in situations where asymmetrical power. How do we build a more powerful coalition that can level the playing field, balance the power so we can have a more equitable negotiation? So improving our BATNA turns out to be key. So that's what we want to do, is we want to improve our BATNA. Now I want to just leave you with one thing, which is, because I see that John has written a coffee break in a second here. So you can develop your BATNA, which is your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. But what I want to suggest to you is people find it very difficult sometimes to develop a BATNA. And I've noticed this time and again, sometimes we forget to do it, or we think we have no BATNA and so on. But what I want to suggest again is that there's something called an inner BATNA. We always focus on the outer BATNA. And the inner BATNA is your own commitment to yourself to take care of your needs. That's your inner BATNA. It's what can you do to take care of your own needs in that situation? It's almost like an iceberg. You know, there's the outer BATNA, but underneath it is the inner BATNA. Let me go back to my friend Abilio for a moment. When he told me that he wanted freedom, and it was freedom to be with his family, it was freedom to make deals, I asked him a question. I said, so Abilio, tell me, who has the ability to give you your freedom to spend time with your family? Who has the freedom to give you the ability to make the deals you want? Is it your arch enemy, the owner of Casino? Is he the one who's depriving you of your ability to spend time with your family? Is he the one who's depriving you of your ability to go out and make deals? Or is it you? Do you yourself have that ability to do that? And that was like an aha for him. Oh, we are hostages in our own minds. And if we can change our own mindset, so he thinks that fine. I don't need to fight this all the time. He went on a vacation in the, I don't know, the Aegean Sea on his yacht or something with his family for a couple of weeks. He decided to do that. He moved his office out of the company headquarters and began to look for other deals. So even while he was carrying on the fight, he went after his own prize. So who can give you confidence? Who can give you that clarity of conscience? Who can give you security in the end if it's not yourself? And that's the key. Is the key to BATNA is there's an external BATNA, but the internal BATNA is only something you can provide. And if we can realize that, then we have more power in the negotiation. And curiously enough, I would say, paradoxically, because Abilio was able to take care of himself, take care of his own needs to be with his family, because he was able to start pursuing his own deals, he relaxed a little bit. And it was that degree of relaxation that allowed us in the end to make an agreement. Because as long as you consider yourself to be a hostage of the other side, either you're going to give in to them much more than you should. The key is, as a friend of mine, Herb Cohen once said, he said, the key is in negotiation is to care, but not too much. That's the thing. You want to care about things, but not too much. Because if you care too much, then you surrender your power to the other side. In the end, inner BATNA is about reclaiming your own power. It's asking yourself, how can I get what I really want? Who, in the end, can give this to me? How can I access my power? And it's about owning your life, owning your relationships. Who is responsible for your relationships? If you put blame on the other side, every time you blame the other side, you give power to them. You're saying you have the power. When you take responsibility, when you own your own needs, when you take self-responsibility, what is self-responsibility? It means I am responsible in the end for meeting my own needs. If you can take that inside yourself, self-responsibility, the ability to respond to the situation, no matter how much the other side has victimized you or abused you, if you can take self-responsibility, you reclaim your own power in that situation. And then you're going to be a more effective negotiator. So essentially then, where that brings us to is those first three things of yourself. The mindset of your balcony, the interests, putting yourself in your shoes, options, your inner BATNA. And then now we're going to take a break. And just before we take the break, in terms of balcony, I have a friend who's an emergency room surgeon. And he is dealing with situations where there's panic all the time. Someone's being wheeled in, they've been shot or knifed or so on. The blood is flying everywhere. Nurses, doctors are in panic. And his favorite way to go to the balcony is he walks into that room and the first thing he says is, "Where's the coffee?" And everyone stops for a moment and looks at him as if he's crazy. He's the head doctor. Someone here is in peril, dying of the thing, and he's asking for a cup of coffee. He says, "Yes, but they all give me their attention." That's the key thing. They all give me their attention. And then as soon as I get the coffee, I say, "Where's the scalpel?" And then I get them from being in a chaotic, disorderly way of dealing with the situation back to step by step, how do we save the patient? So on that note, I'm going to ask you to step out, grab a cup of coffee, and go to the balcony. We'll come back in 15 minutes.
Well, you know what? You've got options. You can either spend time on your in your coffee chatting to people, being on balconies, but you can get back in here pretty quickly. My suspicion is you'd rather listen to William Ury on this one occasion than talk to each other. So let's begin 10 minutes, shall we?
Okay.
Which will inevitably become 12, and at least get some progress.